Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I think we might get started. So thank you to those of you joining us in person today in Melbourne, as well as those that are joining online from around the world. So the University of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, we learn and we live. The Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples, the Yorta Yorta Nation and the Dja Dja Wurrung people. The university also acknowledges and is grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in our reconciliation journey. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and the waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices and caring for country. We pay respect to elders past, present and future and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. Now, I welcome you to our second seminar here today. And today we are really lucky to be joined by three incredible women that are working in animal behaviour and in welfare, who will each share with us their current insights and evidence-based or insights into evidence-based environmental enrichment in their field. So it's my pleasure to firstly introduce Dr. Irene Camerlink, who we are extremely grateful for joining us here in Australia. Irene is an associate professor at the Institute of Genetics and Animal Biotechnology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. She studies pig behaviour and welfare by combining genetics, ethology, behavioural ecology and social sciences. Today, Irene will share insights on practical enrichment for pigs. Please join me in welcoming Irene.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to Melbourne University for inviting me here. Oh, it buzzes, that's normal? Okay. So the title of the seminar is Enrichment Through Evidence, or Better Enrichment Through Evidence. I'll be speaking a bit about scientific evidence, but also about evidence from practice. I would say it's just as valuable evidence to me in really gaining a better understanding of how we can improve the type of enrichment for farms. And I changed the title a bit. I'll make it a bit broader, but I have a focus on pigs just because I have a background in pigs, but I hope that you can still apply it to the species that you work. A lot of the information that I will present today actually comes from a book chapter that we published last year, which was more focused on different age categories of pigs, but I'll give here a bit of an overview of it. Enrichment, first of all, comes from the zoo world, and actually the last talk of today is about enrichment in zoos. And there the definition has been given that enrichment is a husbandry principle that seeks to enhance the quality of captive animals by animal care by identifying and providing environmental stimuli necessary for optimal psychological and physiological well-being. And Ruud Newberry already earlier mentioned that enrichment needs to improve the biological function of animals. So in brief, environmental enrichments are stimuli that improve the animal's health and promote species-specific behavior that helps them to adapt to their environment. And it has a clear purpose in that it needs to provide the animal with the opportunity to express natural behavior and should be biological meaningful for the animals. And this is a bit different with what we sometimes see in practice, that we say, like, we put any kind of objects to animals and say, look, I gave an enrichment. And so these kind of definitions show really clearly that it has to be meaningful for the animal and biologically relevant, rather than just something. When we look at biological relevance, we see from some really good examples, like cattle, brushes for cattle. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but so many studies have found that just simply providing a brush that they can rub themselves gives a higher milk production, and actually a quite substantial milk production. So you see that this is something that is relevant for the animal, that actually has an outcome in its physiology. For growing pigs, the main concern is that, well, any pigs actually, that most of the day they will forage, and having no possibility in a commercial farm to do this can result in abnormal behavior. So enrichment needs to result in something that they can express this foraging behavior. And if good enrichment is provided, then this has often a positive effect on growth, on the immune system, neurobiology, and also adaptive capacity. I specifically want to point out sows just before farrowing. This is a very small time frame, just like 12 to 24 hours, in which in nature they would want to build a nest. So they start, they can dig for a ditch or find a ditch in the ground, and then they walk many kilometers to collect different nest building material, and they tear it apart to, make their own kind of version of a bird nest. And this is an innate behavior that they have to perform. So even if you keep them in a crate where they can't move at all, they will still want to walk for kilometers to find anything and want to destroy and get anything for making a nest, even if they can't. So this gives an extreme impulse in behavior where they destroy anything they find, and that they want any material just to, walk around and carry something in their mouth. And even though this is a very short time period, it's very essential. You see it also in, wait. Yeah, I mentioned this. They need to just get anything, walk around and carry it in their mouth. And if they have the ability to do this, this was off.
Was on. I just don't know what happened.
Thank you. Then you see that if they have the ability to express this normal behavior, then this has a massive effect on their hormones. For example, oxytocin goes up, and this results in a better farrowing process, a shorter farrowing duration, and because the farrowing goes more smoothly, there are less stillborn piglets, and there's a higher live-born lower mortality. It also improves maternal behavior afterwards, and results in a better growth for the piglets. Then in gestating sows is another problem, because they are really bred for producing pigs which grow really fast and have a really high feed intake. And because they would have such a high feed intake, they can eat a lot, but they would get way too fat, so they're feed restricted. This means that they're almost constantly hungry, and because they're hungry, they want to explore things and want to take things in their mouth and chew on things. So enrichment for this kind of age group would be something that they can chew on or ingest. And giving such correct enrichment can reduce hunger, for example, by giving hay that is low in calories. They don't get fat from it, but you need to chew hay quite a lot before you actually can break it down. So they can spend a lot of time on just chewing on something, which keeps them busy, and it reduces stress. It also has a better result on the offspring, because it reduces prenatal stress. Then when we speak about, it's back again. Then when we speak about enrichment, we usually mention physical enrichment. I think it's like 90, I don't have a proper, but my estimate is like 99% of the enrichment studies are on physical enrichment. And so that it creates a more complex environment that animals can interact with. Of course, we also have auditory enrichment, for example, music or other sounds. In cattle, there's also effects that music can contribute to a better milk production. But actually, if you look at the studies, it is it goes both ways, because it really depends on the type of music and the frequency, the volume of it. And sometimes I'm working together with a really big, oh no, sorry, I was say big pig farm, but here it has, the sizes of pig farms are different. So a reasonable sized pig farm, and they introduced also different kind of sounds. They look more into the human literature, where they use the kind of make use of the different frequencies to calm down. And their sounds are indeed extremely calm. When you go in, they don't get up. This music has really a big effect, but at the same time, they use very uplifting music for younger pigs to stimulate them to eat. So in this way, you can use different types of music to stimulate different kind of behavior. Of course, there's also the studies on sound training, that you can use sound cues to let animals learn something, which can also give a form of enrichment. In pigs, olfactory enrichment has also been used, for example, with different scents that they can smell, or flavored verbs. And then the last type of enrichment is social enrichment. Oh no, not the last one. It's social enrichment is another one. We did some work on this with providing pigs with early life socialization, where you see we made a hole in the wall that they can interact with each other, and then you see that they spend more time on social interactions. Also, you can do the same with sows, that they can have a little window between the pens that they can interact with their neighbor. And of course, I would also say that positive human-animal interactions are also a good form of social enrichment. But for pigs, social enrichment can be very important, but it doesn't solve the problem of that they need to forage. So it's important, but it cannot be the sole solution for enrichment. Then last but not least, the cognitive enrichment. Any learning can also really be enriching for pigs. And I think as researchers, we really see this in our studies, that even if we keep pigs in barren conditions, they are not the same as barren pigs in commercial farms, because we do all this kind of behavior test with them, take them out of the pen, they have to do something and learn something, and they are actually quite busy with this. And even if they're busy for 10 minutes a day in a test, then this already gives them something every day. So we have to realize as researchers how much actually we give cognitive enrichment to animals, and that what we have as barren animals that are not really comparable to barren kept pigs in commercial conditions. Yeah, and I'm very curious to the last talk, because it's clear that we really have a lot to learn still from cognitive enrichment that is used in zoos, because for zoos, or animals in zoo, they have really complex enrichment, that animals really have to think and learn of moving things to get certain rewards. And in pigs, maybe because pigs destroy everything anyway, we keep it quite simpler. But there are some examples that you see in zoos as well as in pigs, but not in commercial settings. Now, as I mentioned before, you have enrichment and you have just giving anything. And we have to realize that if you have pigs in a barren environment and they have nothing, and you give anything, they will be delighted with it. And it looks then in the results like, wow, they are so happy with just giving this, but it doesn't mean that it makes it good enrichment. There are a lot of studies on enrichment, and even a lot of review papers. There are more coming. So, but it doesn't mean that, that if it stays within research environment, it doesn't always mean that it's good enrichment if it's studied. I just want to point out again a seminal work from Helene van der Weert, already done in 2023, because I think this is a key paper on what makes enrichment good enrichment. They looked at 74 different items with different properties, studied this in 222 groups of weaner pigs and 222 groups of growing pigs. And they ranked the item based on the properties that they had. And they looked at how the initial attractiveness is, and how much time they spent afterwards, how the sustained interest is. And they looked at the different types of presenting the material, such as loose on the floor or hanging from the wall or hanging suspended from the ceiling, or materials in a metal box on the wall like a hay rack. And they found that the initial interest was in objects that they could investigate, manipulate, what they can chew on, and which they can ingest or eat. And that the items that they could eat or destroy were really the ones that had a long-term, created long-term interest. So the main success factors for making environmental enrichment for pigs will be that it's ingestible or eatable, that they can chew on it, they can deform it and destruct it, which we all know from pigs that they're very good at. Helene van der Weerte and they also later on said that it needs to increase species-specific behavior, maintain or improve health, improve farm economics, and be practical to employ in order to be successful. And in research, we often look just at the first one, but we also really need to consider the other three of how it actually works in practice. And that's what I will speak about a bit later on. The main conclusion from, I think, nearly all research summed up on enrichment is that straw is the best. And there are some studies where it comes out like, oh no, if you give lavender hay, I think it is sometimes it comes out better as straw. So there are some studies where there's something else that is better than straw, but generally straw is just the golden standard. Again, you can destroy it, you can deform it, you can eat it. So it ticks all the boxes of what pigs would like. But because there are several concerns with straw, we went into a long trajectory of research of finding alternatives for straw. And this has created a lot of enrichment materials that are maybe considered as suboptimal. They attract interest, but they don't manage to sustain the interest as much as straw does. And often it comes down to a limited option for manipulating it, or one of those criteria is usually missing. And another option, of course, that criteria that it has to be shared with others. For example, here you see an enrichment item, they can chew on it, but they can't destroy it. But it's also that it's limited on one place, so that it might create competition for access. Also, if it's not hanging but lying on the floor, it very easily gets soiled, and then they lose interest because it's dirty. I just put up a photo with some different materials that have been explored. For example, these things hanging with rubber tubes that they can bite on with multiple pigs together, a wooden pole on the side that they actually eat away the wood, so it's edible. It does depend on the type of wood of how quickly they eat it away, because otherwise you have to replace it quite quickly. It's a lot of work. Straw is of course the best, but then you have straw in a little rack, which is clearly suboptimal for pigs. They prefer the loose straw rather than in a rack. The bite ride, which is actually surprisingly quite successful, and the rooting cones are actually also successful. I think it's the only object that they really are have the opportunity to root something. Luna, or the I forgot the other name. Well, Luna is one of the brand names. It's actually also quite popular, even though it can get soiled quite easily. This one is not my photo. This one I'm not sure. The Yutzak is also very popular also for sows, because they can also rip it apart. They also eat it. We have some scientific data. I'm not sure if we published it, but they eat it away quite quickly. So it's also something that you need to replace, but less often than straw. And it works quite well, but depending on the availability, potato bags in this kind is not maybe used anymore in the supermarkets. And some other wooden toys. The main thing with suboptimal enrichment is that it's one object in itself doesn't do much, or is usually not sufficient. But if you combine them in multiple ways and rotate these materials, then you can actually get quite good results. And then there's also the category of poor enrichment, which we should just avoid. but which seems to be quite common in commercial practice actually. That is objects that do not fulfill the criteria or hardly fulfill the criteria. They cannot be chewed on or deformed or destructed or eaten. They also don't really maintain interest, and they can even be unsafe in some ways, like plastic, because they chew on everything and they can chew really strongly. This plastic, I don't know where it goes, but all these microplastics that get into pigs, I don't know how. I don't recommend pork with enrichment. And also it can be that objects are hanging too high to actually reach this. I show here the ball because this ball is so popular in practice, and if I speak to farmers, they say, "Oh, this ball is such a good enrichment." I say, "Yes, is it?" maybe the first few minutes. But I do want to mention actually this kind of balls. I don't know, but I had basketballs, heavy basketballs for another study, and I was finished with the study. I just threw them all at the pigs because, you know, who knows? And indeed, if it gets soiled, they easily lose interest. But I have a boar, and so he's more than 350 kilos, so he's strong. And he actually dribbles with it. Like the first time I was like, what do I hear? Tuk, 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 tuk. And he managed to really play with it. And if he gets really upset, if there's a female in heat and he gets upset because he can't go there, and he focalizes a lot to let you know that there's a female in heat, but you know, he can't always have his will. So then he throws his ball out of the pen, and then you know it's very serious. That is the moment to inseminate your sows. So even though I usually say this ball is completely useless, in some cases it works, but the pen needs to be clean. It needs to be the right, you know, this basketball is rough, so he can actually get some friction on it. But these kind of ping balls, I don't believe that this is really enrichment. Also about that, if objects are too high, that it's not good. Also another note, because I like to put some vegetables on a rope and I put it slightly out of reach, because if it is in reach, it will be destroyed in seconds. So I put it slightly too high, and I didn't put a video because I didn't want to risk that a video wouldn't work. But they all go up for the salad or the carrot, and then they jump a bit and they get little bits of it. And then half an hour or an hour later, they say, okay, now it's enough. And then I lower it a little bit again, and then they get the rest. And then over the next day, they had something to do, you know. So putting it a bit too high, which is not recommended, is actually in some cases it works, but it's, you know, it's individual tweaking of things that if you know the criteria of what it needs to have good enrichment, then you can come up with so many ideas. It's just that you need to follow the basic criteria that have been outlined in research many years ago are still applicable. Then variety is also important, especially with materials that are not optimal, that if you rotate them, because pigs are so curious and they lose interest so quickly, and if you give every time something new, then they get a new kind of moment that hey, something to explore. And luckily there are plenty of materials that you can rotate with. It's just a lot of work. So that's why I come to consideration is in practice. I didn't touch anything. So if we know straw is the best, but then there's of course for many, many years that farmers will definitely say, no, it blocks the slurry system, we can't do this, which is true, partly. Although these days there are also newer systems which can cope with straw, but it's also an easy way to say like, no, not for me. Another consideration is biosecurity, and this I take really, really serious, especially because I live in Poland and we have a lot of African swine fever. And if you see how many wild boars there are with African swine fever, and these boars go over the fields, and then you harvest the straw, and I give it to the pigs, and it's actually quite a concern because, you know, maybe a wild boar just died there, and you know, not every carcass gets found maybe, and it can dispose there. So it can really be not only African swine fever, that's really the biggest risk, but even smaller risk that you can so easily bring into your farm just by bringing in straw, that a lot of farms say no straw, and this should be really taken seriously. And I think we just have to find an alternative for something that is like straw, but this, or to treat the straw in a way that you don't have to biosecurity risk. I would also say that the dust is a risk for the health for farmers, because farmers are known to have very serious lung conditions because of all the dust. The animals give a lot of dust, but straw definitely makes it worse, especially if the straw is not excellent. Then whenever you give the straw, it is a burden on the lungs. You know, the rest of the day you can be coughing. There are cost and labor, but for straw, I would say that the cost and the labor, it is an investment, but it definitely pays off because it's so clear that straw is just has a good effect on the behavior and the productivity. But if you look at alternatives, comes back, then you see that farmers mostly use point source enrichment, which are much less effective, but they still cost money and they still ask for a lot of labor. It seems much easier, you know, you put some chain with some element in each pen, but of course the pigs change and then you need to clean it. And the pen itself, for power washing, it can go quite easily. But for these silly enrichment items, they take a lot of work to clean properly. And it's really a risk for spreading disease to the next pen when you let young pigs into a pen and there's this enrichment material which might be dirty. Also, what is available for farmers seems to be the worst that there is. Like the first thing listed is the ball. And then this easy fix, that's the word. Easy fix is quite okay, but it really depends on the floor that you have and if it gets dirty or not. And then this anti-bite ball, which I don't know if it's here also popular, but in Europe, it seems that everyone had the chain with the ball on the end, which means they can't do anything with it because it's actually too big to really bite. It doesn't, you know, you can flop it back and forth, but you can't do anything, the pigs can't do anything with it really. Whereas if you just have a chain, I didn't put a cross or a good because it's not considered good, but actually pigs do like to chew on it. My pigs have straw, but if I give them a chain, they also like to play with the chain, just a chain without anything on it. So some of the concerns I have already mentioned. Biosecurity, biosecurity is a big risk, but especially the cost and for purchasing and maintaining it, where time is also a cost. And the time required for changing them and maintaining the materials is enormous. Also a high replacement rate because pigs destroy things so easily. And you might, if you just put one of these kind of items which they sell in commercial, for commercial farms, it's just one item for a pen and they will fight or it's not really aggression, but they get some social confrontation around it. And then, of course, some animals lose interest also because they don't want to fight for something. And then it's actually useless. So you invest money, but it doesn't really have a function. And some things are not compatible with the housing system, and it easily gets dirty. So for concerning research, it's really that there needs to be more attention for practical kind of considerations of how we can more easily manage this on farms. So this kind of enrichment, I would say, is not really always meaningful for the animals, but also for the farmers. You know, what do they have to do? It takes a lot of time, but it doesn't give them anything back because it doesn't really contribute to the biological relevance for the animal. And it's also not in line with consumer expectations. There have been some surveys done, and consumers, they expect mud pools and outdoor walks as enrichment and not just a metal chain. So what we need is enrichment with biological relevance, but also something that positively influences health, production, and mental states, and something that creates sustained interest. And this first top three, I think, are really in research. They are on the agenda. But then what I would also say is to stay closer to the golden standard of straw. We know very well that straw works, but we just know that it blocks the slurry system in some cases and that it's a risk for biosecurity. But finding something that looks more resembles this, like wood shavings that can be, you know, properly treated, or some farmers now also use newspapers. I'm not sure how it is with the safety with ink of newspapers, but these kind of materials or waste products from the paper industry I've seen in some farms give the same kind of properties without having, you know, something completely new to invent. Also, we need cost-benefit analysis. And within this cost-benefit analysis, we definitely need more calculation of how much time it takes to actually implement this on practice. Because when we do this on research farms, we have technical staff and they do it for us. And if we have to do it, we might complain that it takes so long. But if you do this on a daily basis to keep your pigs, it's a massive time investment to keep on giving something. And a few hours later, you look again and it's already destroyed or gone, or you have to replace it. So it's definitely underestimated. And we can't just put this on farmers and say, here, this is what you do, without knowing how much time it actually costs. So what I mainly want to give as a take-home message is that it's not only about the animal. We, of course, need to find things that improve animal welfare, but are also in line with societal expectations, which some items might not really be ticking off. It also needs to be safe for the workers and easy to manage and affordable, which is always the case in farms. But also it needs to be considered whether it actually results in better productivity or better health. And then further considerations are, of course, using local materials. I've seen this at some farms that they use byproducts from certain industries, like the paper industry, where they can actually get materials very cheap that work really well by using local sources. And of course, avoiding plastics, because I don't know if there has been a proper study, but I think pigs, they just destroy it and they get all the plastic goes somewhere. And something that is, I worded it a bit wrong, but that has a low risk of disease transmission, like straw, but also that's easy to clean. I want to end with an illustration from my own pigs. It looks always nice on the photos, but an hour later, it might not look like this. And that's the thing, it goes so quickly. I usually give them straw, but I also, in the corner, you see some paper bags, which are just the feed sacks. So it doesn't cost a thing. And it ticks all the boxes because they can destroy it, they can eat it. It's, this brown paper, I'm not so worried about the ink. And they can share it amongst each other. I give several. So it's an absolute winner, these paper bags, which otherwise would be waste. But the point that I want to make with this is not necessarily what they have, but when they have it. These pigs are just put 3 different social groups together, which would definitely result in fighting. And this is a moment of heightened stress that they don't know what to do. They see strange pigs and they will fight or be afraid or whatever. And at that moment, I give a lot of enrichment, especially what they haven't seen before. And they start playing and they get excited and they play. Before they know it, they play with each other. And then they get tired and they fall asleep. And then they wake up and then they suddenly, oh, who are you? And then they already have the same smell. And they were hardly fighting. This was actually after recouping an hour later. So they have no skin, or I don't know if it's a dark skin, you don't see it so well. So they don't have many skin lesions, don't fight much. They get nice and tired. And it's not only what you give, but also when you give it. For example, with sows before farrowing, or pigs when you regroup them, or weaners when they go into a new accommodation, to give something that they can do, that they're not so afraid in such an empty room, or just simply, if you give anything to pigs, give it at a moment when you expect a peak activity. That's, during the day when they are at the most active, they want something to do. And if you give it then, it will be more effective than if you give it, in the late afternoon when they're already almost going to sleep. So there's much more to cover on enrichment, but out of consideration of time, I wanted to leave it with this and just leave it to questions later on. Actually,
Thank you so much, Irene, for starting us off in a fantastic way. As you mentioned, we are actually going to have a Q&A panel at the end where we'll have our 3 speakers up here. So hold on to your questions. We're going to just take a quick 15-minute break to allow everyone to stretch their legs, grab a drink, use the bathroom, do what not. So if I could have everyone come back and join us both online and in person at 2:20. Thank you. Hey, welcome back. So we might continue with the rest of our program, and I would like to introduce our next speaker. So Peta is an animal welfare scientist in the Animal Welfare Science Centre at the University of Melbourne. She has a research focus on improving the welfare of meat chickens, laying hens and breeders by reducing negative experiences and promoting positive ones. Peta is committed to providing industry relevant evidence-based solutions to improve poultry welfare. So it is no surprise today that Peta will share her experience with evidence-based enrichment solutions for the meat chicken industry.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for having me today. Short period of time, so I'm just going to give you what I think, what's hot and what's not in chicken enrichment. More specifically, I'm actually going to give you my list of what's hot and what's not in enrichment for meat chickens. So if you are unfamiliar with meat chickens, we always talk about laying hens, we always talk about laying hen enrichment, but I'm actually talking about this chook on the left here. I actually took this photo and then I asked Gen AI to remove the background and it made them a bit weird, but it's actually two chickens are the same age. And so the one on the right is a laying hen. She looks quite juvenile there, selectively bred to produce over 300 eggs a year. And the meat chicken on the left, same age at 42 days of age, selected for meat production. So very different chickens. Let me tell you a little bit more about the one on the left. They live for about 5 to 6 weeks, so a relatively short life, but certainly worth giving a good life for. So enrichment should be considered. They're usually housed in mixed sex. So unlike laying hens, where we usually focus on the ladies producing the eggs, boys and girls live together in flocks of about 45,000. They're not housed in cages in Australia, so 85% grown in barns and about 15% in free range. And yes, they grow quite quickly, so 2.2 kilos in about 32 days of age. So this is important. They may look like adults, but they're actually young, juveniles. And that rapid growth can have consequences for welfare. So we do know that there is an increased risk of metabolic diseases and poor leg health. And we also know that activity decreases at around about 4 weeks of age, where they'll spend about 60% of their time actually. So we can see why I get so riled up about saying which chicken we're talking about enrichment for, because obviously their needs and their capabilities differ. So what's hot? Outdoor ranges. We know we've done a significant amount of work in the free range space, that those chickens that use the range have better cardiovascular health, stress resilience and stronger legs. And just recently, we've actually done some trials where we make them pay a price, which is to jump over a barrier that gets higher and higher. And some individuals will pay a really high price to get access to the range. And that tells us that it's really important to them. So here's some of the work that we've published around this, if you're interested. And this adorable photo is giving chickens visual access to the range. So not just going out there, but actually providing a little perspex pop hole and visual access to that range. We've shown as increased stress resilience, changes brain development, and cognitive flexibility, and some other sort of bits and pieces. Reduces productivity though. But outdoor ranges, hot to use and hot to see. What's not hot is avian influenza. Goes without saying. Look, there's a whole complexity about how it spreads, but we do know that access with wild birds in the same environment can increase risk. And so some people are suggesting that we shouldn't be doing free range. So maybe winter gardens. is a nice in the middle. I can see these being hot. This is a little winter garden. You can see they've still got pop holes on the shed. They come out. There's a different substrate for them to peck around in, natural light, but minimising those interactions with wild birds and some of those biosecurity risks that Irene was talking about. And we know, I loved seeing some of your points, Irene, because touching on those too. So I know I'm on the right track. We know that winter gardens have sustained use and they actually increase activity of the chooks by about 22%. What's not hot? Plastic chains, balls and string. So we did some work early in my PhD. Paul was part of this, and we published it to show that chickens don't really interact with balls and chains. Maybe at the start, maybe we needed to think about basketball dribbling. We published this, but still, I would argue the majority of enrichments provided on farm are these yellow chains. Maybe a little bit of interest at the start, but unless they're being dynamic or increasing novelty, certainly very little sustained interest. And same with balls. So I got frustrated and we did it again. And so this is some research from this year where you can see balls even lower and chains didn't even make it on the graph. And ropes or string have been shown to be enriching in some ways, in some conditions, but this is some of our chooks from earlier today, and you can see she's got some string that's come off, caught in her crop and around her leg as well. I felt pretty bad, and then I saw people on TikTok showing the same thing and also on Facebook. So increasing that risk, and so, yeah, not hot. Perches. Perches are hot. 97% of all chickens grown in Australia are RSPCA approved and they must be given a perch, which is great. Perches are particularly important. We see this in laying hens because they're an anti-predator response. Makes sense at night time. You want to roost, you want to get off the ground. The interesting thing when we look at meat chickens is that the fast-growing meat chickens typically use this during the day. So it's a different function for them. It's not about roosting, and they actually probably would just be learning to roost from mum by the time they're slaughtered. So it seems that there's another function for this. Maybe they're trying to get off the litter, maybe they're trying to rest without being disrupted. We're not sure, but there are some reported benefits. So some improvements for leg health can reduce sores from sitting or dermatitis from sitting on the litter and cleaner plumage. But use of perches is actually pretty low in meat chickens, and this is an Australian study that estimated about 1.25% of the flock use the range, but it depends, use the perch, but it depends on the context and the strain and the age. Females like to perch more than males. That could be just morphologically they're smaller and maybe it's easier. So what's hotter than a perch? A platform. So this is a platform. You can see nice little ramps going up. It's certainly much wider, and this is what it looks like when chooks are using it. So it's got those same benefits, improves leg health, reduces dermatitis, and it has been shown that meat chickens prefer these over perches, maybe because they're wider and support them, but also they have a preference when they're younger to sit underneath them, maybe like mum, that they would typically go under. It's darker. We do see that with perches as well, but obviously more space to be able to do that. There's been some great work. This, I think, came from Vienna. So sorry, Jean-Louis, I forgot to cite you here. But if you are going to increase these perches or platforms, it should be done at about 5 centimetres at a time to train them. And I think what we need to do with these perches now is how can we design them to manage that manure, so you're not sitting under there and getting dirty, and also a mechanism for how we can monitor the health and welfare of the birds underneath. It's pretty, I think we can manage that. What's still hot? Hay bales. Hay bales have been really great for chickens. They're a multifunctional enrichment, so really highlighting on some of those things we heard from Irene, that their use and preference and what animals want to do with them shifts over time, whether that's with age or during the day. We know that they like to sit next to hay bales, maybe again, a bit like mum when they're younger, and then they like to pull them apart and sit on top as they age. The type of hay bale preference shifts with age, and plenty of research, and here's just one, have shown that it does improve leg health. And cognition. But what's not hot? It's like we wrote our talks together. Cute. Biosecurity risks. So yes, we've spoken about this today. They can attract pests, holds moisture and mould, and that increases the risk for the flock health. But there are people who are using this on farms. So good management and good suppliers can help mitigate some of those risks. So maybe when I talk about hay bales being hot, I really want to talk about this multifunctional enrichment. So maybe enrichments that provide for different needs and functions throughout life could be key to sustained interest, use and effects over time. Looking at what's going to be hot next season, maybe technology and laser enrichments. There's been some pilot studies looking at this with chooks. Interaction's low, so I'm looking forward to having a chat about how important is interaction when we're talking about enriching animals' lives. It did increase over time, it increased activity of the birds, there was no impact on chronic stress, feed intake increased, so some production benefits, and reduced fear in those commercial flocks. So some things we can work with there, enriching, I'm not sure. Perhaps things that can improve this. What are their preferred colours, images, optimal speeds? What are the important times of day that we should be providing these enrichments? But again, a nice one for producers to put up, create some novelty without that additional time. And maybe one of the most important things, I don't know what this thing is here, is control. So in these studies, they actually put the lasers down, and if you're sitting underneath them, you've got a laser on you. So how important is it for those chickens to choose when to interact with that enrichment and how they want to, rather than having some of these put on you? So maybe what's hot here, yes, technology and lasers, because they're always hot, but is control and agency around enrichments. And the last one, what's not, sorry to say, scatter feeding. Probably great for your backyard chooks, but plenty of studies have looked at whole wheat, shredded cabbage, alfalfa pellets, wood shavings, live mealworms and black soldier larvae. They do increase foraging, they do increase activity, and so therefore, not surprisingly, we see improvements to leg health. But foraging isn't sustained, and it's really about how much is put out there. So it's dependent on frequency and amount. So that's a big investment from producers. And it also reduces their feed intake and performance. So it's time consuming, its effects are short-lived, and it compromises productivity. So not hot. The little black dress of enrichments. So what's classic, what's always hot? Evidence of effective enrichments. And I think this is critical. We've spoken a bit about this today. Often we see we've provided enrichment, we tick a box. How do we know if it is actually enriching? It's so difficult. I don't want to bring this down. This is a really nice benchmarking scheme. It's not from Australia. I really want one of these for Australia, where people under this QA scheme will put in their percentage mortality or whatever that may be. And we can see there are percentage of birds with environmental enrichment. So fantastic, they're considering that. But what if they're all those chains? I would argue that they're actually not providing enrichment. So how do we go about this? Maybe it's about prescribing items that have already been shown to improve welfare in a range of conditions. So we know that growth rate will differ, how they interact with some of these things. If we take perches, for example, the material, the height, the circumference, all of these design things change how the animals use it and therefore their effect. So it's really difficult to actually prescribe items for a range of environment and animals. So best, gold star, we need these animal-based measures. So is it about use and sustained use? Is it about these behavioural time budgets where we're seeing a reduction in perhaps some behaviours with negative affective states or more in positive affective states? And so to do this, we're actually not far from it. We're automatically detecting behaviours in sheds already. How do we use this technology to provide evidence that the enrichments we're providing are actually enriching? So, wrapping up my what's hot and what's not list. Hot enrichment items for meat chickens are designed specifically for meat chickens, taking into account the age, the development, and some morphological constraints, for lack of a better word. Hot enrichments allow choice and agency. They do not harm. They are practical to implement, which may mean that they are multifunctional, or maybe using technology to provide novelty and those sorts of things to reduce that load from producers. They sustained interest and use or, let's discuss this, are associated with measurable improvements to welfare. So that's me. Thanks for listening. And if you want to talk about what's hot and what's not, please email me or chat to me at the break.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. And before we start our final session for the afternoon, if anyone has any questions, by all means, you can start to pop them in the chat and we will come back to them when it comes to the Q&A. So our final speaker, I would like to welcome Sue Jaensch, and she is an animal behaviour specialist at Zoos Victoria, where she is a key member of the Zoo Animal Welfare Research Team. She supports Zoos Victoria's life science team by providing animal behavioural data to inform decision making and to coordinate strategic initiatives that focus on enriching the opportunities for animals in their care and providing opportunity for agency. So please welcome Sue to the stage where she's going to share her knowledge on improving enrichment experiences for animals in zoos.
Okay, hi. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Zoos have a long history with enrichment, and today I will share with you just a few examples of how we're evolving our practices to align with scientific evidence and provide environments where animals can flourish. Enrichment started in zoos about 50 years ago and is now solidified itself as a critical component of animal care in zoos. Today, our regional governing bodies ask organisations to demonstrate their commitment to positive welfare, which includes providing evidence of functional and effective enrichment programs. There are so many different definitions for enrichment out there. So colloquially, when we're talking about it in zoos, we're generally talking about a component of animal care that involves the animal caregivers providing inputs to the animals. These programs are often designed by the people that are caring for those animals, and they're often tailored to the individual as well. One tool that animal care staff use is this list of types of enrichment that is used to ensure that animal care staff consider the whole holistic opportunities and provide a range of experiences for the animals in their care. And typically results in inputs that I'm assuming most of you are thinking about that look something similar to this. Animals interacting with inputs that have been added into their environment. Are these programs effective? And what I mean by that, does enrichment provide good or positive welfare outcomes? When we look at the published research, we can draw on a paper that was written quite a while ago, but environmental enrichment for captive animals, which just focused on zoo animals, looking at the research and what evidence was out there on zoo enrichment. Looking at three main lines of evidence, there was enough evidence that we saw some changes in animal-based indicators that suggests that, yes, indeed, enrichment can be effective. but there's a bit of a theme. I don't know if Peter and we were talking, does it work in practice is hard to say. Yeah, and we have the same experience in zoos as well. Whilst we can look at some studies that might show us whether the animal care staff are evaluating the program and how they're evaluating the program, just how effective these programs are on a day-to-day basis is difficult to determine. And this isn't uncommon in the real world applications. We've already heard today some examples about the challenges of applying the science in real world applications. Synthesizing all of that great research and introducing it into industries can be really slow and costly. And there are definitely challenges in integrating it into policies and guidelines before it's implemented, or it might be challenges in fitting it into existing practices and values. So whilst definitely and ultimately, as Peter said, we're looking for those animal-based indicators, there is other evidence that we can draw on to assess how enrichment is going in zoos and if there's opportunity for us to improve. And we'll look at a few of them today. There's been a lot of knowledgeable and creative people that have been working on this problem over the years, and 15 minutes really doesn't give it justice. So I do want to acknowledge all their amazing work, but what I've chosen to focus on is just a few examples that are more recent and some of the work that we're doing at Zoos Victoria. So some of the operational evidence that we look at, we can look at how effective the process is in practice. A good zoo enrichment program ideally has a clear target that's set about promoting opportunities for positive experiences, providing opportunities for meaningful behaviour. Then this helps the animal care staff to identify what inputs to provide and also gives them a good idea of what they should be looking for if they're assessing if their program is effective. What we tend to see, however, is a bit of a move away from this, a tendency to drift where animal care staff might focus more on the input. They get inspiration from Pinterest or a cool video on social media, and that becomes the inspo for their enrichment program. And least desirably, we see programs that are really input-based across the board, where animal care staff may set targets that are more relating to the number of items that are provided, or that nice range of options like we looked at the categories. So they're hitting every category in the list, and then their programs are evaluated based on that outcome. Now, it's fair to say that these still may be achieving some great welfare outcomes. It's hard to know that for sure, and it could be that that staff are spending a lot of time and their resources on something that's not effective for animals. So how are zoos responding to this challenge? In recent years, the welfare team at San Diego Wildlife Alliance have been fine-tuning their outcome-based animal care program, which encourages animal care staff to base their enrichment programs on species-typical behaviours. So they first start the program by asking staff to consider that, then also the context in which those behaviours may be occurring, and also to consider the cognitive and physical adaptations that the animals would be drawing on to engage in those behaviours, all before then identifying what these behaviours look like so that they have a clear and measurable target. Then they design their inputs based on that. So this program is aiming to foster enriching opportunities for animals to engage meaningfully with their environment. A little bit closer to home in our region of the world, our governing body, which is the Association of Australia, has moved their accreditation model that used to require organisations to provide evidence of enrichment programs by asking for evidence of a calendar or a plan that's written down. And now they require members to provide evidence of the animal's experience, particularly looking for evidence of positive experiences like play and exploration. And at Zoos Vic, we have moved away from the traditional environmental enrichment programs and are aiming to substitute it with experience categories instead, taking the focus off inputs and promoting animal care staff to consider the range of positive experiences that animals could have. We're optimistic that these initiatives will move us away from input focus and ensure that we are on target to meeting animal experiences and opportunities. It's also reasonable to propose, we'll wait and see how we go, that by refocusing onto behaviour and promoting animal care teams to consider animal experiences, that enrichment programs will be successful at promoting positive subjective experiences, so more experiences above the line in the blue there, so that we may have an impact overall of promoting a positive welfare balance. Other evidence that we can consider is whether it is actually occurring in practice. Whilst it's true that enrichment's a critical component of the work that we do, when surveyed, animal care staff often report that it's challenging to provide enrichment because they don't have enough time or resources, which we've also talked about today already. Animal care staff are frequently juggling competing priorities, and despite its recognised value, there's a consistent evidence that's one of the components that's often dropped when times get busy. So whilst we will continue to advocate for time for the animal care staff to be able to sufficiently run these programs, what other ways can we tackle this problem? Well, to redefine enrichment, and that's what we've been working on at ZooSvic. So as part of our continuous improvement program, we ran a review of our enrichment program back in 2022. And part of that involved a staff survey where, as part of the survey, they responded and suggested that we look at other areas of our work. There were some areas that were negatively impacting the enrichment program, say, for example, habitat design that might preclude the animal caregivers to providing enrichment at certain times of the day. And they also identified that there were other parts of their work that could provide more enriching experiences, like Marnie with her browse here. If we could actually optimise the availability of browse throughout the day, we could be less reliant on enriching or foraging inputs. So it begged the question, what are we calling enrichment? For the purpose of our exercise, we chose a definition that was something like this, that enrichment's the act of enriching, adding or changing something to the environment that does improve the physical or psychological well-being of the animal. If it does not enrich, it's not enrichment. And then we asked what components of the animal care work actually had the potential for enrichment. So obviously we started with enrichment, and this is becoming a bit of a semantic tongue twister, but follow me. And then we moved a couple of the kind of obvious components of work across, but the more we talked about it and the more we thought about it, there is actually a lot of potential in all the core components of the work that we do to provide enriching experiences. So we now recognise that all of these components have the opportunity to provide enrichment when intentionally used to provide experiences and enhance the animal's experience. And we've rebranded what we would typically or previously called enrichment to now be environmental enrichment. And that is actually that core component of the work that will still exist, where animal caregivers are providing inputs into the environment with the intention of enriching experience. So we can have ineffective environmental enrichment and use that term correctly, and acknowledge that sometimes with all great intent, we won't have the outcome that we're intending. We're optimistic that this change will mean that we'll increase the opportunities for us to provide behaviour experiences and also fully integrate that into the work we do, and that our program will be less vulnerable to being dropped off when times are tight. Animal care staff will be able to think beyond the confines of a traditional enrichment program and choose the right tool for the job to achieve the most effective outcome. Today, I've shared with you just a very few couple of examples of how we're using evidence to improve our effectiveness and how we're working to align our practices with scientific evidence and provide environments where animals can flourish. To help us achieve our goals, my hope is that the animal welfare science field will continue to provide us with ways that we can measure particularly positive animal welfare so that we can achieve that practically in the work that we do. And also investing in longitudinal studies to help us better understand those critical variables that Irene already touched on today. So I'm looking up some of those papers for those long-term enrichment programs. As we move forward, zoos need to commit themselves to measuring the impacts of the changes that I've talked through today to assess whether these initiatives do in fact lead to positive welfare outcomes. And if anything has sparked your interest today, please get in touch. And similarly, if there's anything that you think would be super helpful for us, I'd love to hear from you. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Zoos Vic Enrichment team whose work I shared with you today, and thank everyone for their time.
Thank you very much, Sue. Please don't go too far because I'd now like to invite our three speakers, so Irene, Peter and Sue, to join us up on the seats for some Q&A. Excellent. So we've got a microphone.
Just stop the share.
Thank you. All right. So I will invite people to pop up their hand if anyone is in person has a question for us, and online, please add it to the chat and Jeremy will identify questions as they come. Okay, we might start with in person. So do we have anyone with a question for one of our speakers, all of our speakers?
Thank you. I was actually thinking of implementing this back home, but like back home, we mostly have smallholder farmers. So I wanted to ask all of you, like, how could I pitch this to smallholder farmers or resource poor farmers? And is there a way that like I could get support from you? Like, let's say I go back home and I pitch that this could improve their productivity. How can I best package that in a way that they would be interested and would be ready to implement? Thank you.
What kind of species would you mainly be thinking of? What kind of species would you mainly be thinking of?
Poultry and pigs.
Poultry and pigs. We also spoke a bit about it. It's mainly the challenge to find something that fits the local situation, because to follow like the international kind of standards or what is portrayed in research or what industry bodies are selling on websites is really not the best, and farmers really risk losing money into something which is really not effective. And whereas there might be local sources which we cannot identify because it's really country or even regional specific, that could be just waste products that actually could work really well, given that they are safe, like that there's not something that can be harmful for the animal or for the human. But if you can identify something which is in your area or which is in the farmer's area, which anyway would be there and can be something that the animal can, well, it differs a lot between pigs and chickens, but well, both of them don't use the ball and the chain. that's a clear one. But if you use branches, it depends on where the branches come from. If it can be a biosecurity risk, but simple branches, they can chew on it for hours, pigs. And I think chickens, they also like to peck at the bark. So if there are branches in the environment and you just take some and you put it there, it doesn't cost anything. And if you can show that enrichment in general gives good results for animal health and welfare, then I think it's a good situation to tell this to farmers.
I think you've nicely summed it up, but I always have to have a say, so I will. I think that's right. I think putting in something that's meaningful to the animals, and I really like that this is the behaviour, it's rooting or it's whatever that behaviour is, and this would allow it to express that, is a really great place to start, and making sure that it is evidence-based, because producers that I speak to want to enrich the lives, but if you have to, and there's very little guidance about what works or how it can be practical, or then you put in something that isn't enriching, which reinforces the belief that enrichment is just a waste of time. So I think actually getting it right Maybe it's about targeting those behaviours and then measuring it in certain ways, which sounds easy, but maybe it is about productivity that breaks that cycle that enrichment is just something, you know, that's a toy and it's anthropomorphic.
And I know my experience isn't with farm animals, but I definitely have experience of working with people who don't think that enrichment is a good use of their time. And so when you're trying to influence a population, I definitely think starting off with someone who is already invested, because they'll be a bit more resilient if the programs doesn't work the first time, and will stay with you until you can trial a few, get through the glitches and come up with something that might work. And then that creates interest if it's working. And hopefully when you get interest, that's when you start to get buy-in from other people and you can grow from the kind of ground roots up sort of approach, which I've found is helpful to bring people along to an idea that they aren't rushing to sign up on day one.
Sorry, told you I always have to have a say. Yeah. I really liked also the point about the dust being an issue for the workers. When we put windows in commercial sheds, I wish I'd had the foresight to capture the stock people's attitudes in response to that, because that's important as well. If there's more natural light or whatever they're experiencing, it's ticking multiple boxes, right?
Excellent. Good consideration of some of those barriers when we're thinking about practicality and how we apply them. So really nicely thought of. Jeremy.
Yeah, we've got 3 questions online. The first one, it's a bit difficult to understand, but it's from Viran. And I think what he's getting at is, or she's getting at, is what are the funding sources available for environmental enrichment in the 3 sectors we're talked about today? Where does the money come from for the research?
Yeah. We've had quite a bit of success with both meat chickens and laying hens. Would we like more to do more? Yes. And often I think it's those long-term studies and a holistic approach that's maybe, but I feel like the producers, if they've got to tick the box, they want to make sure it's meaningful, that gets taken up to the RD&E. So certainly from chooks, I think there is some support there.
It really depends on the country that you're in and whether there is, what kind of funders there are. If, like in Poland, there's hardly any funder for applied research. So with enrichment, you wouldn't get far unless you can argue that it's good for humans or for medical research or something. But like microplastics and that it is a risk for human health, and then you argue it this way to study something with enrichment. But in other countries, there are plenty of funders for applied research, but you need to find a novelty, and just going on the same track for certain species, especially for animals where there's been a lot of research on enrichment, can be a challenge.
In a zoo setting, it's a little bit different. So there is definitely some operational budget that's set aside. And I think, again, but I think the theme is if there's convincing evidence that it's effective, then there's a good justification for further budget allocation.
One more online, maybe.
More online is, have you found that enrichment is more effective on juvenile animals than adult animals? And is there a specific difference on enrichment measures dependent on age and species of animals?
I'll start because I have the mic, and I was thinking as like juvenile and adult, but then we've got from invertebrates to elephants. So in a zoo setting, that's quite unique. I think it's easier to enrich juveniles. I think we can get away with being a little bit novelty sometimes works in our favour, and young animals who have more energy and tend to be throwing out a whole lot of more behaviour makes our programs look really successful. I think we sometimes don't think enough about what's really valuable valuable for adult individuals. And also what we, if we think of an animal just playing with a toy, yes, maybe then that's effective for juveniles. But when we're thinking about enrichment for adults, it's about functional behaviour and how can they go through their days 24 hours around the clock engaging in functional behaviour that's meaningful for them. And that's true no matter what age the animal is. It's there's an opportunity there for us.
So beautifully said. And I guess I always get stuck on this. When does enrichment become standard housing? So I've got to.
No, I completely agree with the first point. But we do have to take into account that they have their individual preferences, especially young animals. They engage a lot in social play and they all go along with each other, and it doesn't matter if they like it or not. They just enjoy engaging with others in whatever they engage in. But for other animals or adults, I see at least with the sows, they have their specific individual character, and one just likes to take some things in her mouth and walk around with it. And the other likes to build a nest in the corner before she sleeps. And like this, they all have their individual preferences. So giving one item and saying that this will work for all animals, it doesn't really work.
Well done. Before we go back to the online one, we might just see if there's any other questions in person.
Thank you. My question was, give me a second to phrase this, but what sort of ways do we use in a zoo environment, but I suppose in the other environments too, I don't know as much about them, but what kind of things can we do to actually gather the evidence that we're getting? Like, I know about behavioral observations and camera traps, but is there anything else or like ways we can gather that evidence in those statistics?
There's lots of ways. We try and identify practical ones, right, though, in a zoo setting. And so it depends on your goal that you have, as that might help inform what data to get. I think in an applied setting, our data collection isn't always going to be robust. So the approach that we're working on at the moment, we don't have a great plan. Maybe get back to me in 6 months and I might have a perler for you. But we are looking for multitudinal data. So can we get data that is the animal interacting with the item first and foremost? And that might be achievable on a day-to-day basis. So we get kind of a weak quality data, but we get a lot of data, which will help strengthen that answering that question. Then what we'd like is maybe some broader questions about activity budget. And so over time, are we actually shifting behaviours and we're seeing more of the desirable and less of the undesirable? And that also helps to get us some short-term answers to feed back into the program and some nice long-term data as well. So I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect one measure that will give us that answer. And I think the best way to approach it in an applied setting is see if we can get different groups of people gathering different data and all together kind of give us a more robust score.
Yeah, it's that beautifully. What she said.
Yeah.
Got an interesting one here, I think, perhaps. Is there evidence of negative forms of enrichment that push animals to engage with positive enrichment? Or is this just unfeasible due to cost and labour requirements? So are there negative things that you can do to an animal which pushes it to use positive?
Oh, yeah. Little challenges through early life, then building resilience. Yeah. Yep. I think it's really interesting, maybe for a beer after the seminar, but that idea of how important is interaction? Because if you put something in an animal's life, like the windows or the lasers that creates change and novelty and complexity, that may be little negative experiences or stresses for them to process that then has developmental changes. So we've shown cognitive flexibility changes, neurogenesis in the parts of the brain, that hasn't necessarily been about enrichment. So again, I think it just comes back to that definition of what is enriching and how do we assess it. So I would say yes.
Yes, you see it a bit with barren housed animals that have nothing, and if you give anything, they will engage a lot with it, which makes it seem positive towards the assessment of the object. Whereas if an animal always has something and then gets it, it might not be interested at all in it. So indeed, if it has a negative experience of having nothing, then it creates a stronger interest in enrichment. But I wouldn't say that we have to keep animals in a barren place just to get more interest, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that answers the question.
To add to your thinking, and two that came to mind, two ideas that came to mind, is that I think we've talked about that importance of a challenge to help individuals learn to be resilient in the environment that they're in. I think it's always, I always caution it though, because the more, when you open the gate and say, yeah, it's okay, then it becomes a very common thing in a program. And there are some animals that are already in negative and shouldn't be put under those situations. So it's yes and no. It depends, might be the answer. I think the other one is recently I heard of a story, and it's something that's used maybe specifically for some social groups where, and this was particularly for meerkats in an introduction plan, where they did actually provide environmental stresses during an introduction. So kind of similar enrichment, but actually enrichment that caused a value in a group that didn't know each other well to actually bond together and behave socially under a slightly stressful situation. And sometimes with introducing meerkats, there can be a lot of aggression, maybe like pigs. But in this situation, the introduction of a negative stimuli was found to be beneficial.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions in person from our audience?
I've got a question for Irene. So it's obviously very important to provide effective enrichment opportunities across all production stages. But in terms of research, you mentioned that one of the key focuses should be on looking at practicalities of enrichment. In addition, is there a specific age or stage of production where you think current research efforts on enrichment need to focus?
Well, the critical age in pigs is when they are young, but they're weaned and they're growing, but they're not yet adults. So they're very active and very explorative. And that's also when they start tail biting more and, yeah, becoming social, but also showing a lot of socially unwanted behavior just because they're teenagers and they just want to explore everything, positive or bad. But all the research, I think, is focused really on this group. It's just a matter of, if you keep pigs on such a small space allowance in a barren pen where there's nothing, and then providing such a small items is just like a drop of water on a hot plate, you know, it doesn't have enough effect within the housing systems that we have. But the focus is on the right age groups.
Any other questions in person for our panel? Or online? Oh, yep.
So a question about stereotypic behaviour in particular. Would environmental enrichment suffice, or is it better to do total enrichment where you're targeting cognition, etc.?
Yes, thank you, Irene. Oh, that's an interesting question, and that's another we're kind of on the precipice of looking at ZoosVic at the moment, that we're really in examining the word enrichment and what enrichment means. I'm wondering if we're actually having the right conversation, and we should be more talking about overall behaviour goals, and then how do we design all the components of animal care to support those behaviour objectives. And then it doesn't come down to a conversation about, do we just focus on this one component to rely on it to help animals with stereotypies. So as Irene was saying, it's a drop in the ocean if we just focus on environmental enrichment, because there's so much else about the environment and the conditions that are contributing to that problem. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think enrichment definitely has a place, or enriching experiences, if you think of the zoo's new definition, in contrast to just relying on the environmental enrichment program to achieve that outcome.
Excellent.
Oh, excuse me. I was just going to make a comment about a negative experience being enriching. There's a large amount of literature on particularly laboratory animals that indicate that a challenge that's not too weak but not too strong is very effective in terms of stress resilience later in life. And there's some evidence also with farm animals. So yes, I think negative experiences can be beneficial, and therefore perhaps we can assume that they're enriching, particularly early in life.
That's also why I mentioned that behavioral tests with animals can be enriching. For example, we do a lot of cognitive tests, and in the beginning it is challenging. You know, they have to be isolated on their own. Pigs don't like to be on their own. It is a challenge. They have to learn something which is actually quite complex. But we also test for motivation. So we record the motivation every time they go to the test room. And we record the speed with which they run over the corridor to go to the test room. And some they go so fast and they lose the control of their body and they fall over the floor and they get up and they run inside for some it's correlated with how good they are and they find treats and so on. But some are not good at all in this test and they don't find the food rewards, but they're still so motivated to go just to go in and do something because they know they will get even the reward of being in there and that they have something to do. Yeah, it's good to have a little challenge. Otherwise, lives get just boring.
And I think to add to that and go back to your previous point about individual differences as well, because it can't be too big. If they're not competent, then that's fear and anxiety and all sorts of negative outcomes. So it's how do we give challenges that are appropriate for different individuals, perhaps, or they have control around that challenge.
Some more research, perhaps. Excellent. Got another one?
Hi, it's me again. Second question, slightly different. In terms of variation being important in enrichment, when does environmental enrichment kind of just become standard housing? Like, what's the kind of difference? Because I know with a lot of enrichment, you have to take it out so that it is new or like take it out for a bit so then it's new and if you put it back in or something similar. So then when does it ever become non-enriching, especially in like farm animals and stuff? Or not as enriching, not as beneficial, et cetera, et cetera?
Another point of why I would say that straw is, why straw is considered the golden standard. They get straw every day, it's there the whole time, but it gets dirty, of course, so it gets cleaned. And whenever they have straw, they seem fully engaged with it, as if it is complete. Well, it's not. It's on one hand, it's not completely novel. The item is not novel, but every straw seems something completely exciting, and they do the same. And it's the same as foraging. They spend a whole day grazing or whatever they do in the nature, and it doesn't get boring. But if it's this static object, which is just always the same and which they can't really interact with properly, then I think it becomes a bit a part of the housing environment.
This is quite tricky and sounds like a plug, but a few of us got together, Megan Verdon and Caroline Lee, and we wrote a framework about continual improvement using enrichment, and was ultimately providing enrichment that reduces stresses, and then providing different spaces, because acknowledging that different animals in different spaces have different housing. So if this is what the housing looks like, and you put it in and it reduces stress, it's probably enriching for that point. But what we would hope is that society, and there is progress in that space where then that would become standard housing. So then you would say, well, if we're going to provide enrichment, then we go beyond that. And we had a few measures around how to maybe do that, because if you set the bar so high, then it's almost unobtainable. So
I think I'm a bit like you, Peter. I've always got something to say. I think it depends on, and it comes down to semantics as well. When we're talking about enrichment, we're looking for something that actually benefits we've added to the environment and it's benefiting the animals. So the measure is, if it's not achieving that, is it still enrichment anymore? So looking for whatever measures that you have that help you assess that. Interestingly, when we were doing our enrichment deep dive, we actually wondered whether in the future we would love to get to a situation where enrichment's not required, that the environment is providing for the needs of the animal and we aren't reliant on that. And so kind of then we're looking at a dynamic environment that provides opportunities for animals to engage in functional and meaningful behaviours in their environment. So if you're adding something in, the question is it achieving its goal? And if it's not, and then that's when you probably reassess it.
Do we have any more questions in person? One sec.
Got a couple online. I'll probably, because of the time, or just one. For Peter, you discussed benchmarks for assessing enrichment effectiveness, but the model was not specific to Australia. What metrics would you include for an Australian specific model?
oh, bloody hell. It's really difficult. And that benchmarking system was a welfare one. We don't have that welfare benchmarking system for Australia. I think that would be really neat to say, you know, mortality and all sorts of things. That goes beyond enrichment. So probably didn't explain that quite so well. But in that welfare assessment was proportion of enrichment. I don't know what the answer is now, but I think we can definitely find the answer. I always talk about beers, but I went to the footy the other day and I bought a beer by pressing my phone and it let me in. Then face recognition picked up my face, put it to my phone and the beer I took and charged my card. If we can do that at the footy, we can measure behaviour in a chicken shed, you know, and get some meaningful data out of it. Sorry. So I think it's not about saying, yeah, but we can't do that yet. So we just say we've provided enrichment. Maybe at the moment we say we've provided these types of enrichment, which we have shown are important in this context for this species. But ultimately we should be moving towards how do we assess that more accurately.
And I think ZAR, or the Zoo and Aquarium Association of Australia, is onto something. We're asking for evidence of experiences, which is the outcome of the enrichment. So you're not looking for measurements of inputs, but measurements or output measurements. And so, yeah, hopefully with your computer help, you can work that out for chickens.
Let's get on that. Jeremy, one last in person.
Sorry, I'm interested in farmers' awareness, their acceptance and the adoption rate of enrichment, like in your different fields.
It depends which country you are, but in many countries, it's in the legislation that farms have to provide specific enrichments for certain groups of animals. But the description in legislation is not always very precise. And as a consequence, for example, in pigs, there was a lot of use of the chain with a ball on it, because it then counts as two enrichment objects, the chain itself and the ball at the bottom. But now it has become, at least in Europe, it has become more specific, that they say that it has to have certain characteristics that pigs can actually use it. And like this for other animals also, there will be things in legislation, but in other countries or other parts of the world, it will be more maybe industry-led, and industry bodies might have requirements rather than legislation, and they do checks. But it's also very well known that farmers will, when they know that the inspection is going to come, they put fresh items and everything looks perfect. And then the person, the inspector is gone, and then it will never be replenished or updated. So it's it depends on the attitude of the farmer, and luckily there are also now more studies on farmer attitudes, on not so much on enrichment actually, but more animal welfare in general, and this relates to each other. You know, if they care about animal welfare, then enrichment is one of the first things to think about. But if they don't care about animal welfare and are mostly business driven, then we can't expect that they would do such things by themselves usually.
We did a survey of us, like a cross-sectoral survey in Australia a few years ago, and looked at what enrichments are being provided and how that matched what was in the literature. So these things show to improve welfare. And a lot of the response was, yeah, but we can't implement that because of X, Y, and Z. So just really highlighting that disconnect. So I think in Australia for meat chickens, as I said, 97% of all chickens grown in Australia are RSPCA approved. And RSPCA say you must provide pecking enrichments, this enrichment at what density. And we've talked about all of those certain things before. And I think if producers are doing it because they're told to and there's no effect, then it devalues the whole system. But when they put in something and said, actually, I don't have to turn the litter anymore because the birds are doing it for themselves, they're foraging more, or I see, you know, less mortalities or whatever it is, then you would see a greater increase. I forgot what question I was answering.
If it's all about, you got like
Chickens. Yeah. So yeah, it depends on where you are, and yeah. Thanks.
Said basically what general public, yes, that's a different story. Yeah.
We perhaps have time for one quick one
Okay,
from
very quick
online.
one. So this is from online. I think it's about extensive livestock, about rotational grazing and or offering different types of forage. Do they need environmentally enriched? Do they need to be environmentally enriched? An extensive animal?
I think you made a very good point saying, hopefully we go to a system where we don't need environmental enrichment anymore, because we add environmental enrichment to give them an outlet to express their natural behavior. But if they're in a system where they can express their natural behavior, then why would we put artificial things in it? Nature is the best enrichment there is for natural behavior, I would say. So I think not. I also did some of my studies with free-ranging pigs. They had hectares of land where they could just root and wallow and graze and everything. And actually, so they didn't have any environmental enrichment, and I consider it not needed. But sometimes they would find some objects in the field. You know, they have almost hundreds of hectares. And then they would find a jute bag or a piece of plastic. And then even adult animals, they start showing play behavior. And they make this low to walker play. They take it in their mouth and they jump a few times around, but it lasts a few minutes and then they continue walking to follow the herd. But it shows that even if there are novel objects in an environment, they still enjoy engaging with it. But nature in itself, it's enough. You know, even without any objects, they are completely fine.
Could I, and maybe it's because I work a lot in the intensive industries, and often, and also I work with free range a lot, and often I think we dichotomize things. This is what intensive industries look like and this is what extensive ones look like. Because I've driven past, I don't work with extensive systems, but I've driven past some paddocks and been like, that's pretty barren and boring. So I think maybe like simple categories might not be sufficient. So if they have those things in the paddock, where they can express those behaviours, then yeah, that's great. But I don't think we should assume.
We've got a lovely recent example where our elephants have moved from the city zoo out to Werribee. And it's actually been an interesting social challenge for the animal care team looking after the elephants, because the elephants don't need enrichment out at Werribee at the moment. It's very new and novel space. It's the size of Melbourne Zoo. The footprint is huge, and it's been designed to have complexity, to have a lot of choices that the elephants need to make on a day-to-day basis to get from one resource to the next. But the actual group that have become really dependent on providing enrichment and ticking that box is still wanting to give them the toy. And we're seeing such a higher diversity of behaviour at the moment. So I think, yeah, it's not as black and white as we'd like it to be, but it's really nice to see if sometimes you do provide the right environment, that you don't need to rely on those inputs.
Excellent. And that seems like a good spot.
Can I actually ask a last question? Sorry, you guys said you like the last word, but I'll add one. Because I think it's really related to these points that are coming up now, but it's probably, I have pigs in mind here. At what point do we need to stop trying to find effective enrichment items or opportunities that fit our housing systems? You know, at what point do we need to stop doing that and instead start focusing on actually changing the housing system so that it is compatible with what kind of enrichments we know are successful? So obviously my thought process here is around pigs. Why don't we actually start changing what their housing looks like so that we can actually offer straw or other substrates?
Oh dear, that's the famous question. Yes, and then most farmers would need to stop and change the whole, and you know, buildings are built for at least like 50 years and you can't just change the system. Even making relatively small changes in the housing system, just in the way that the building is laid out, has such an impact on productivity, because everything is built with such a narrow margin for the profit that you make on pigs, that even understocking slightly by changing space allowance, for example, is giving a big impact on the revenues for the farmer. And I fully agree that the way that we keep pigs is not the way that is good for their natural behavior or for their behavioral expression.
So no solution there.
No, I think there is really a chance for when new buildings are built. That's where we should focus, but that seems to go completely separated from research. You know, there's no research on there are some actually some research on how to design systems and so on, but it's not really engaging with industry. For example, in China, when the pig sector is booming, they I don't know, they have the money and they start building up, you know, multi-story buildings for pigs, completely new, and they actually have interest in things like free farrowing and you know, systems for better animal welfare, not necessarily because they think it's better for animals, but because they think they can make profit out of it. And if there is a farm advisor or an advisor at such a moment to say, well, if you build a new farm, then please make this little change so that you will be having better outcomes, then that would be essential, but that seems to be missing. But yeah, how many farmers build a new farm? You know, it doesn't happen every day, but a lot of farms stop every day, and that is something to consider as well.
That seems like a good point to finish on and to leave us pondering. So please, everyone, join me in thanking our three presenters for their fantastic presentations and really interesting Q&A. All right, before we break and in person have some tea and coffee and perhaps some beers, as Peter alluded to, I'd just like to thank our in-person audience and our online audience for considering what is a really important topic. And as I think we saw noted across each of those presentations, that when we're thinking about enrichment, it is really vital that we come back to effective enrichment. So that which is biologically relevant and results in some change in biological functioning in order to bring about those positive experiences. And I think it was really, really quite thought-provoking, really useful. We identified a number of recommendations, perhaps what's hot and what is not. And that's really important when it comes to applying it practically. But as Irene also alluded to with one of our questions, where we're starting to think about it when it comes to policy and legislation as well. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we look forward to having you back with us in a couple of months for our third seminar. So I would actually, before I finish too, I almost forgot, but also like to thank Dr. Megan Lucas, who really did all of the hard work, and it was only right that you got that last question. So thank you very much. And those of you here, please join us for